Welcome once again to Arctic Fire. This unique gathering of swordsmiths explores the outer edge of the craft, where craftsmanship, artistry, storytelling, history, and myth combine. This year, the group has recreated objects found in the legendary hoard of Grendel, from the most ancient surviving poem in Old English, Beowulf. 4 days of live broadcast, in which legends will be reborn. Arctic Fire 2016, Grendel's Hoard.
A lot of people ask me about casting bronze. So I've been casting bronze since I was about 12 years old. When I think for my 12th birthday, my father gave me a centrifugal casting setup. He had a foundry, he's an artist. And so I was like carving Ninja Turtles out of wax and stuff when I was 12 and casting them in bronze. I was making my own toys. People ask me about casting, I use a vacuum caster now, and people will ask me how I go about casting stuff, and I'll start out by saying, well, first you carve something, and then you sprue it, and then I'll go through details about how to do the burnout and making molds and stuff, and people have come back to me and be like, I have a really hard time carving the wax. So the carving, I guess I need to talk about a little bit. Wax you can get this wax. This is probably ferrous wax, and this is a piece of Dave's wax. There are different colors of wax, and with the ferrous wax, the purple is quite hard, but it's more flexible. So if you drop it, it doesn't break. And then there's green wax, which is harder, but more brittle. But for doing very fine detail carving, I think the green wax is amazing for doing fine detail carving. I've just kind of rediscovered it. I was making everything out of purple wax, and I started carving with green, and you can get a lot finer detail. So I'll talk about the thing I'm going to carve today in a little bit, but first I'm going to talk about just with this object. Dave, can you grab the brooch that I brought that's on the table? I have an example of a cast thing that I carved out of wax. So to get the shape that I'm carving into, I have to carve the wax. I don't get a shape like this, I make it. And when you're talking about sword fittings, I start out with a block of wax like this, and I have to carve the wax to fit the sword. Before I do any ornamentation, it's the actual, and actually the most important part of making fittings for a sword is the initial shape. So if you make a really blocky crossguard or pommel for your sword and then do really beautiful carving on it, it's still just a really blocky piece of equipment. So the most important thing is the actual three-dimensional shaping of the material. And the cool thing about machining wax is you can machine it. So I make my fittings for my swords exactly the way I make steel fittings for swords. I grind them, and then for making the holes, I cut them out with a jeweler's saw and file them. So it's exactly the same process as with steel. So I'm just going to take this piece here and do a little bit of grinding on it just to show you what you can do, and then I'm going to lay out a design and scratch it in and do the initial carving, and then I'll kind of finish carving and show you about how I design knotwork. So I'm just going to grind this first. So I'll go over to the grinder here. And the thing that's cool about this is that this doesn't melt when you grind it. So you can take it and so just like I'm going to make just a kind of a dome shape on here. This is just like grinding steel, so you can put a mini bevel into the wax. and then grind back from that. So now I kind of have an edge here, and then I can take the surface and form it to the shape that I want. So that's as much grinding as I'm going to do for today. And now I use this tool, which is actually, it's a tool that I got from Lee Valley. It's designed as a lemon zester. So it's for actually making little bits of lemon that you put in cooking. But it works really, really well for shaping wood and wax. And I use it extensively for shaping grips for swords and wax fittings, because you can really move stuff a lot, like very quickly, but with a lot of control. And you can change the shape of things. And really have fine control over manipulating the general shape of a thing. And when I did Arctic Fire 2013, I was carving the grip, or the front guard on the sword that we made, and I didn't bring this with me, and I was trying to do it with a knife, and it just took forever. It's kind of embarrassing, actually. So that's how I shape the wax. And then this is your tool that you left at my house. So then what I do is I'll take sandpaper and sand that down. This, you can see that I sanded this to very smooth. And then once it's sanded down, I actually just freehand draw the knotwork that I want to carve onto the wax with a pencil or with a scraper. And when you have a drawing that you're trying to fit onto wax, basically what you're doing is you're taking something that you've drawn on a two-dimensional space and trying to make it fit into a three-dimensional space. So it's the final design process is this kind of scratchy business here. So once I have it kind of scratched on there, then I go in with this little tool and just kind of scrape in the lines. And this is where when you're doing knotwork, there's an over-under structure. So when I draw knotworks on, I just scratch all the lines over each other, and then I decide which ones go over and which ones go under when I'm cutting it in. So that's basically how I get to the point that I'm at here with this piece. So for designing this, I decided that I was going to make a dragon brooch in keeping with the theme of Beowulf. In the Beowulf poem, at the end of the poem, he goes in and fights a dragon, and it's the end of his life. He ends up getting killed fighting the dragon. And the dragon is actually the progenitor for Smaug. It's a dragon that's hoarding a great pile of jewels. And I think there's even a section where somebody steals a cup, which is the same as, like, really the story of The Hobbit is kind of a retelling of that that story. So I decided to design a dragon, and I started with, I wanted to take mammon-style ornamentation and kind of subvert it into something that was my own. So it's really kind of going into an illustrative state. So I don't know if you can see this. This is the drawing that I did for this. And the way that these knotworks intertwine is very much like the mammon ornamentation from the Viking period. But then I've taken it, and as I come around to the more figurative section, I've taken the dragon and made it into something that's a little bit more representational of how I imagine a dragon might look. And part of what I want to do here is I want to make this dragon look really frightening, and also kind of take it out of a historical context and make it slightly more mythical so that it becomes a contemporary artifact. So that's the drawing, and then I take that and I just freehand scratch it onto the wax. And now I'm going to carve it, and it's going to be really boring. So I just cut the lines in like I was demonstrating on the other piece. And when I'm carving, there are these, one of the things that's really cool looking at ancient carvings is the techniques that they use for representing things. When I first started carving, I would just carve the background down below the lines of the thing that I was carving. But initially, I saw Jim Kelso, who's a master Netsuke carver from Vermont, who he had carved this bat into a piece of wood, like the animal bat, not like a baseball bat, and. The way that he carved it was he actually carved it as an inverted, he carved it so that it was actually into the wood. But what happens is when you're carving, it's almost exactly the same as a photograph or drawing. You're actually playing with light. You're playing with the way that the surface of the material refracts light, and you're creating an optical illusion. So what he was doing with that is, it's actually a Japanese technique, but it's inverse carving. But it refracts light. It basically captures shadow, so it looks like it's sitting on top of the surface of the wood. And it was just this kind of watershed moment for me in my understanding of how carving works. And then, like many things, when you've recognized something, you start noticing that thing everywhere. And I noticed that in a lot of the Viking Age carvings and the Migration Period carvings, they actually don't recess the background of the carving. They leave the background flush, and then they carve the illustrative part down away from the background. And what it does is it creates strong shadow lines that outline the subject that the person that's carving the ornamentation wants you to look at. So I've started doing that with my work. And it means it's actually also a lot easier to carve because you don't have to carve the background out. So I'm starting to work on the dragon's head here, and I'm just going to start leaving the background proud and rounding out the edges of the carving down to create a bas-relief of a dragon's head. So I just carve the edges down and round these lines, and it takes a long time. But not as long as it takes in wood. It's actually pretty quick compared to wood. And the thing that's cool about this material, this wax, is that it has no grain. Like when you're working with wood, you'll start cutting and you'll feel, I'm caught on a piece of grain, and if you keep going, it'll rip out, and then you'll just have a big shred in the carving that you're doing. But that doesn't happen with wax, so you can really just carve from any direction, which it gives you a lot more freedom. It still will chip, and I'm not sure I know people who find issues with wax carving. And I mean, if you're watching this and you have any questions, please ask me. I'd be happy to answer. Oh, great. Oh, go for it.
Justin Mercier writes, are there particular shaped tools that you like the most for carving wax? It looks like much of your tools are wood carving tools. I bought a set of wax carving tools from Rio Grande and found that they worked terribly poor on the hard green wax that I got from Jim Kelso, and I kept chipping out the pattern I was trying to carve. Should I assume that for hard waxes I should treat my carving tools just like wood carving?
That's what I do. I use all my tools that I use are from Lee Valley Tools, and I use Japanese detail carving chisels is what they call them. And I also use, I don't know if they still have these, but I got this set of micro chisels from Lee Valley, and this tool right here is the best tool for carving wax. You can cut lines with it, and then you can, it's a scraper basically. You can cut lines with it, but you can also cut the corners off of things with it because it has edges all the way around it. So it's like a little hook with sharpened edges, and it is a really useful tool for cleaning things up and just getting in there. And I use it for when I'm putting the shadow lines in around the carving, and it's a really handy tool. But mostly I use a straight chisel and a skew chisel. Those are my tools that I use. I use that for cutting in, and this for carving. And I'm sure there are better carving tools than I use. So I wouldn't say that I have the best carving tools, but they work really well for me. And I've told a lot of people about these tools, and I've noticed that there are a lot of people now using this set of tools, and I think that's a good sign that other people find them useful as well. And they're cheap. They're not expensive. It's like if one of them gets damaged or worn out, you can just buy another set, and it's like, I don't know, they're like $8 or something. They just cost almost nothing.
I use the same tools, and I find them also very handy as being like micro scrapers. You could put them more or less perpendicular to the surface and
Yeah.
scrape it.
Yes.
Like a little plane or whatever you want to call it.
They're great, and I find for me, what I do is I don't use that many tools, and it means that I know the tools that I'm using really, really well. So I'm not having to switch a lot, and it saves time not having to switch tools all the time.
Jay,
Yeah.
would it be possible to see the alterations you may have done to your tools for the carving that you do?
Oh, right. So this is a straight chisel, and it comes with a handle like that. But when you're using a straight chisel, I use it really close to the wood, and the handle bumps into the wood. So I just grind the handle down, and that way you can get really, really close to the wood. It never bumps into anything. The only downside is that sometimes the blade will come out, but it doesn't affect the carving. You just work with it. So sometimes when I come to a very tight turn in a knotwork, I'll actually take the background out, so I have it going down to the base of the carving, the underside, if that makes any sense. I don't know if when I'm talking about leaving the background proud, I'm making sense or not, but you'll see when I finish carving what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is right, I don't know if you can see this on camera, but right here, this is the background, right? So you would think it would be below the surface, like underneath the dragon, but I just carve this down, and then I leave a line here that's the edge of the background, and it actually makes it look like this is on top of a perfectly smooth background that's beneath it.
Jay, question on that very subject.
Mm-hmm.
Sean Hollywood. So when you cut in the lines, the background doesn't get touched at all, only from the line inward is carved?
Yeah, that's right. Unless I decide to texture the surface of the background or something, but I don't usually do that. I just touch the edges of the background as it relates to the line that I'm carving, or the actual carving part.
And the angle of the cutout on the line
Right.
will affect the shading and the width.
Yeah. So by having the edge of the background be at more of an angle, you just get a wider outline around the image that you're carving.
And James Elmsley says, is there any particular grind or hone on the chisels, or is that just standard chisel bevel?
It's just standard chisel bevel. These tools come very, very sharp. So I sharpen them when they get dull, but I keep them at the sharpness, the bevel that they're carved at, that they come. So I have a hard time talking and carving at the same time.
You're doing great, man. Julian Antunes says, fascinating work as usual. I've been risking some wood carving on a sword hilt, but I'm having a hard time to have some kind of fine finish on the low corners of it. Do you have a technique I could use? I think he means trying to finish the surface of the right towards the bottom of the shadow lines.
I don't 100% understand the question. The low corners. Maybe if you could repeat the question a little bit differently. I'm not 100% sure what you mean by the low corners that you're trying to finish. But I'd be happy to answer. I'm just not quite sure what you're asking.
And Nick asked, do you ever work the other way around, hogging out the negative space?
Yeah, well, that's what I did when I started, always. I would always cut the background out and then carve the knotworks so that they were on top of it. And so, yeah, I have done a lot of that. I don't usually do that now, but I do sometimes. I mean, that's basically what it's like when I'm doing knotworks on leather. And yeah, it depends on what I want the thing to look like. So this isn't the only way that I carve. It's just one way that I think looks really nice particularly with this style of ornamentation. But I'm certainly not married to it.
Follow-up from Nick. I suspect that must be much more time-consuming with a lot more material removal.
But yeah,
Removing the background.
right. Yeah, it is more time-consuming, definitely. And also, it's harder to get a smooth background. So one of the things you can do if you're working with wood is you can actually pierce the knotwork, so that so you take a saw, you draw the knotwork in. Take a saw, cut the whole background out, so the background is just actually empty holes. Carve the knotwork, and then place it on another background that's perfectly flat, and then you have a smooth background. Because when you're carving it, you're going to have the backgrounds. It's not going to be flat, or it's going to have marks in it that are hard to get out. But the other thing you can do that I've done is I've done backgrounds where I texture them using a punch. And that can be really pleasant too, like the way you do with leather. You take a kind of a round punch and texture the background.
And then another question, is there any source material you can recommend for learning some style of decoration and or carving? I assume he means besides our Arctic Fire videos, which are, of course, the best available anywhere.
So source material around the designs for carving?
To learn how to carve.
Oh, I don't really know. I guess there's probably lots of carving stuff on YouTube. I've been carving for a lot longer than YouTube has been around. So I learned from my grandfather, who was a cabinet maker, and just from practicing carving and seeing other craftsmen over the years, like Jim Kelso, carve things. But there are some, if you're interested in Iron Age ornamentation, there are some amazing books with just pictures of original artifacts, and I think that you can learn a lot by looking at these ancient things. And also, the other thing that's really cool is if you're in if you're in Britain or Europe, there are some incredible wood carvings in churches that even and quite old. Like there's a church in Lincolnshire. It's called the Lincoln. What is it? It's called the Stump, and it's got you'll see the Lincoln imp and stuff like that. It's not called the Stump. It is. It's called the Stump. Owen was looking at me as if I was wrong, but. Anyway, it's got this incredible carving from like 1300s of people being eaten by wolves and different craftsmen making things and stuff like that. And you can find publications that have beautiful photographs of these carvings. And I find as you carve things and learn to carve things by, seeing techniques on the internet and going onto carving forums and whatever way you learn it, or interacting with people who are good at carving. When you look at the pictures of these original things, or actually get to interact with the original things yourself, you can start to see, it ends up being like a conversation with these craftsmen who spent their whole lives carving things. So you can learn a lot about carving by looking at artifacts and kind of trying to get in the headspace of the people who carved them. And it's the same thing with looking at original swords. You see ways of looking at the objects that are different than the way we look at them now, and they actually reveal a different worldview because you start to realize, like, well, these guys were more concerned about function than aesthetics, and their aesthetics are, even though they're really beautiful, they're really rough. So they must have served a function that's different than aesthetics serve now, which is that they're not about quality, they're about almost during the Iron Age, this ornamentation wasn't just pretty, it was actually powerful. It represented almost like a magical incantation. So I think that the people who carved these things actually understood them to be something that was maybe a little bit more than decorative.
Julian follows up the question you asked him to repeat. He said, sorry, I mean the deep spots where I can't reach them with sandpaper. So he's talking about finishing the deeper parts of the
Right. Well, you can use scrapers. So let me think about it.
steel wool.
No.
There was a question about wood carving.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't use steel wool on wood unless you're using a very dark wood. Like anything that has any lightness to it, if you use steel wool, it will get all dirty from the steel wool, and it's really hard to clean off. What I do for getting to the bottom of places that are hard to reach, like if you can see this carving here, where these grooves are, they're quite deep. And what I do is I take sandpaper and just put it over the end of my thumb, and I use my thumbnail to polish in them. And I also use, if I can't reach it at all, I'll use a scraper like this and just kind of get right down to the bottom and just gently kind of scrape it out. Some people use glass to polish wood. I just use sandpaper and my thumbnail most of the time. And when I'm carving, a lot of the time, right now I'm carving on a table because I'm doing a presentation, but it's actually a lot slower way to carve. The way that I normally carve is I carve like this. And I'm a lot faster at it because I can move the object as I'm carving. Because you can kind of curve so I'm not just using my tool, I'm also just angling the object while I'm carving. And that's really, really hard on my back.
I spent an afternoon doing that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't walk for a week.
Yeah, it's really hard on the back. But it's just so much faster. So when I'm working in my shop and I want to get stuff done, that's how I carve. And it's a terrible way to carve. I don't recommend it. It's just what I'm used to, and I've been doing this for like 20 years, so I'm kind of stuck now. Yeah, don't be like me, children. So I'm just kind of cutting these lines in deeper with my little unnamed tool. We'll call it Fred. So what my grandfather told me is that you should always name your tools so that if you can't find them, And you just say, where's Fred? That's one of the weird things about working alone is I don't know the names of any of the tools I use because I don't ever have to ask anybody to pass them to me. So I'm just like, I know what I'm looking for, and I can just walk around muttering about trying to find it, but I have no idea what it's called. So now I'm carving in the teeth. The vicious teeth.
Jake from Justin, do you have a preferred rubber or RTV silicone for making molds of your waxes when you need to cast multiples of an object?
I've been playing with Mold Max. Mold Max 30, it's like bright pink. And that I haven't been doing rubber molds for that long. For a long time, I didn't feel that my work was good enough to ever make a rubber mold of it because I felt like I would do a better job next time, so I didn't want to just repeat the same thing. Only in the last few years I've started working with rubber molds, and I actually started when I did I made a mace for a show called Arcade Arms, and it was like just this crazy project on a really tight deadline. So I just made a quarter of the thing and then made rubber molds of it and then cast them and fit them together and then cast the thing. And it was great. It was really liberating and cool, and the possibilities that it opened up are quite exciting. So I used rubber molds on the giant hilt because it's such a big thing, and it's better to be economical about your use of time so you can make more cool stuff. Instead of carving the same pattern twice. I just carved it once and made rubber molds. So the Mold Max 30 is nice, and I think I used Mold Max 20, but I couldn't really tell the difference. The Mold Max 30 is maybe a little bit denser. And it's also a darker color, so you can tell when it's mixed more. So I'm planning on doing some more projects where I'm using rubber molds and playing with them, like maybe doing some rubber molds of antler and then carving it and playing with stuff like that, but we'll see. So as you're carving the lines in, what you're doing is you're creating a space that's going to it's going to impede light from getting places. So what you're doing is you're actually creating shadows in places that will refract light, and it changes the way that the object looks. And what you want most of the time with stuff like that is, I'll just draw on this if you can get a look. If I'm looking at the cross, like you know what, I can do this on the board here, but I don't have a.
Yes, it's straight. It's not straight.
Aha! So when you're carving something like, I'm carving a dragon head, and I want it to be feel really alive. If I carve it and I go like this, if that's the cross section that I have, it will look just like that, but it will just look like it has a line around it, right? So it's still pretty not a very alive feeling thing. And if I just take the corners off of here, you get still kind of a chunky, not that alive looking creature. So what you want to do is you want to round it so that there's just a peak right at the very, very top. And it's a thing that you can see what works best with the carving. And sometimes maybe having a little bit of a trough there to create a shadow. Suddenly your dragon has shading. It's like cross-hatching when you're drawing it. It creates life and realism in the carving. So really focusing on making those lines cast a really nice shadow, because the way the shadow works here is going to be it's going to reflect, it's going to bounce light off of here, and you're going to have some shadow here. So it creates this very realistic looking thing that feels much more alive than if you have a blocky corners on your carving.
And in the cases when you're working with like grace lines, inlines for the shape,
Yeah.
that does affect the sort of the cross-section shape of the body, doesn't it? You want sometimes to have a little bit of material for the actual grace line to be like a separate ridge, or not to just fall in dead shadow.
Well, what I do, I usually do grace lines on, like grace lines are when you have you have a knotwork that is, you have lines intersecting with each other like this, and they have lines inside the lines like this. You'll see it a lot on Scottish dirks, but a lot of these knotworks have two lines cut in them. Sometimes they'll have like little dots inside the lines. They just complicate the knotwork and make it look more. They just make it look much more complicated. So if you look at say the Sutton Hoo belt buckle, that has a lot of lines that are just simple lines that are looping around each other like that, but then they have one or two lines that are just cut into them, and sometimes they have little dots in them. And what I find, I usually do quite a round cross section, and then cut the grace lines in so that they're quite a sharp angle like that. And what they do is, even if they're over here, they actually bounce light off of them in a way that this doesn't. So if this is in shadow, you'll actually have light here. It'll still be catching light a little bit. Yeah, so I actually usually do kind of round them to do the grace lines, but then I cut the grace lines in with a chisel like that. That's got a V chisel. Yeah.
In this case, you will be soldering the bezels in, or you will carve the bezels?
No, I'm going to solder bezels in. So I'm having, what bezels are, if you don't know, are, in the drawing here you can see they're a stone set. And the stones are, well, I guess we don't have the giant sword here, so I'll draw it on the board here. What you have, when you have a bezel, it's, so say I have a nice stone that I want to set into a guard. The stone is shaped like this in cross section, and then you have a little cup out of silver that is shaped like that, and you just put the stone into the cup of silver, and then you just rub the edges of the cup over, and it holds the stone in place, and you can solder the cup into the onto the metal. And soldering is like a type of metal fusion.
From James, any tips or tricks for refilling or repairing wax when a sculpt does go wrong, chips or goes through?
Oh, yeah. So, although it can go really wrong with this piece that I have here that's now bronze. When I made it, I made it very, very thin on the back. I carved the whole thing, and then I carved the back out to make it very thin. And I went through in a little tiny place, and I was like, oh, I'm going to have to so what I do is I actually melt wax and fill it in. With this one, it was so thin that I melted wax and filled it in, and the molten wax was enough to melt like half of the thing and just ruin the carving, so I had to recarve about half of it. But that's what I do. If I don't have a wax burner here, but do you have like a torch like that you light your forge with? Okay. Yeah, if I could borrow that, I can just show you.
It's a map gas torch.
Yeah.
It's going to be pretty strong. Actually, I've got a little butane one now that I think about
Sure, like a butane, it doesn't really matter, just something that I can heat a piece of metal up with. So I use a bit what amounts to a wood burner, but you can use
a nail or something
a nail?
to heat up.
No, I'll heat this up. Or heat one of these up. Does it stay on? No?
Yeah, it is, but. Oh, there you go. Perfect. This will be better.
Okay. So if I have say I have a nasty, I'll just put a nasty scratch on this. So, do you want to see me ruin something? So I'm carving this, right, and I'm like, whoa! And I've got a big scratch or like a big chunk, like, crap. Look what I've done. Oh no, I stabbed my piece. What am I gonna do? Then what I do is, oh, cute. Oh, not that guy. What I do is I take, you can take a tool and just heat it up. Or you can use like a wood burner, which is what I use. I have a wood burner and I made a little tip for it. And you just take some wax and you just drip it into the wound. And you can kind of melt the background. You basically just weld it shut. And the other thing you can do that's kind of cool is if I wanted to make like, say, like I've done some things. Oh, maybe I'll keep that for a second. I've done some things where I've done, like I did a piece for Owen where I made a sword with, well, that would be cool to actually, could you grab the sword that I did for Owen? Because I can show you. So I made a sax, I hilted a sax that Owen made the blade for, and I made skulls on it. And the way that I did it was, I just made little drips of wax to build them up. Just a second, I gotta get this hot again. You can just heat wax up. Sorry, this isn't ideal, but you just melt wax and drip it on, and then you can have like a nice little rivet head, or you can make it bigger and then carve it and create cool little details in a piece. And doing melted wax, yeah, so like this piece here, these were each a drip of wax that I built up and then carved. So that's another way you can do. You can actually, that's what's cool about wax carving, is you're doing something that's both reductive and additive, or whatever. I'm not sure what the term is, but I'm carving. I'm not used to talking when I'm carving, or even thinking. And then if you have too much, you just carve it away. So there's really not much that can go wrong that you can't fix when you're carving wax. Even when I first started carving, the first sword that I made, my first professional commission was for a biker in Halifax who was a tattoo artist with a massive septum piercing, which is like when you have a piercing through your bridge of your nose right here, and he had like a spike that was that wide that he would wear right in front of his eyes. And yeah, and he wanted a giant sword, and so I made a sword that had a raccoon skull on like a solid bronze cast raccoon skull on the crossguard, and I was carving it out of wax, and I dropped it like 7 times. Oh, are we out of time? We got 2 minutes. Okay. Anyway, I dropped that and it broke it into many pieces many times, and it just welded it back together, and it was fine. He got me storytelling, and I forgot to carve on the piece.
We actually just wanted you to tell stories.
Yeah, one time.
That was actually, we all knew that.
So yeah, that's the slow process of carving.
Are you done soon?
Yeah, I'll be done in 7 or 8 hours, maybe 12 hours from now, and it's going to be awesome. So what I'm going to do with this guy is I'm going to carve the knotwork so that it starts out rather traditional, like a fairly traditional knotwork, and then curves around, and as you come closer to the dragon's head, just the dragon portion of the knotwork will become more and more naturalistic, so that the head of the dragon actually has skin and folds around the eyes, and becomes something that's almost a little bit realistic. So that when you look at it, you're like, what I hope happens is you look at it and see a knotwork, and then look a little bit closer and you get a little thrill of like, ooh, that's horrible.
All right, great.
Okay.
So, thanks, Jake. That was
Yeah.
awesome.
Well, thanks for watching. If you actually watched, if you watch me do this, you're crazy.
Hey, so
so
listen,
boring.
No, it's fantastic.